afternoon and welcome to the continuation of the October 19th, 2021 regular meeting of the Lane County Board of Commissioners. We're now on item 11, Public Works. 11A is a report, the Lane County Parks Funding Task Force report, PM and NBA 12/18/2018 and 7/9/2019. And with us are our distinguished guests, Mr. Brett Henry, Parks Division Manager, and Mr. Bob Kiefer, Special Districts Association of Oregon. Gentlemen, if you would take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Burney. I believe Steve Markowski wants to say something first, and then we're going to have a couple of folks that want to give a little testimony. Ms. Janelle McCoy, who was the chair of the Parks Funding Task Force. And we see if we have Mr. Clark here. I don't see him on the panel, but at some point, Mr. Clark wanted to talk as well. And John Clark was the vice chair of the task force.
Well, Mr. Markowski only has permission to talk if you give it to him, Brett. You're in charge of this.
Oh, I like this power. Yeah,
all right. So I'll be real brief, just to say that this is has been a long time in coming. We can go back several years to when we were in the process of developing, updating our new Parks Master Plan. We did some really great public engagement through the Parks Master Plan and our Park Advisory Committee to update that master plan and really develop a long-term vision for our park system. That also helped us identify, what our priorities are for the system. We've done a facility assessment, which has helped us really dive into the facility condition and needs for repairs, deferred maintenance, and other investments that are needed in our park system. And 2 years ago, we proposed, as part of our proposed budget, a Parks Funding Task Force. And the idea was really now to take all this information with our long-term vision through our Parks Master Plan, the facility condition assessment. We're beginning to now understand what types of investments our park system needs. How are we going to think about funding our park system into the future? So we formed this Parks Funding Task Force through Brett's great work in bringing on Bob Kiefer, who you'll hear from. And of course, Bob's reputation precedes him in our community with the wonderful work he's done, both with Lane County originally and then with Willamette Lane Park and Recreation District. Bob led a group of incredibly talented, broad, diverse group of residents who participated really in a tough environment over the past 2 years, virtually, mostly working together to develop this funding recommendation plan for you. So I just wanted to set that context that this is a big discussion, and it's one that has been in the works for many years and culminating now in this report. So I don't want to take any more time from Brett and Bob and the members of the advisory body, but I just wanted to share that brief historical context.
Well, thank you, Steve. Janelle, are you online here? Do you want to say a few words?
Absolutely. Thank you for the privilege of being here and for the privilege of being able to serve Lane County as the funding task force chair for the Parks Division. When we started, parks are important to the physical and mental well-being to the constituencies that live in our county, and having parks helps to retain and gain employees. It serves tax base and makes our collective investments in housing and businesses that much more valuable. Lane County, as we know, is the size of Connecticut and has parks that vary from natural areas with only a few buildings to infrastructure to those that are highly customized for recreation and camping. Both attract visitation and provide customers to surrounding businesses, and so again, they contribute to tax base. However, we're really faced with a much smaller parks team than in years when many of these parks were built, with many more people to serve these days, and parks don't have a sustainable funding stream. Park systems in other counties or cities that are much smaller have bigger budgets and teams to help maintain our parks. Thus, there's been an abundance in the wrong way of deferred maintenance, which we sorely need to address. So commissioners, our charge to you is to fund the Parks Department to the level that it deserves so that it can serve the community upon which it relies. Not just those who can afford the privilege, but those that stand to be impacted by it even more. Thank you so much for your service to our community and for engaging in this discussion.
Thank you, Janelle. Appreciate those words. And I don't see John Clark on here. So if he shows up, is it okay? Yes.
This is Diana. Sorry, I'm communicating with Mr. Clark right now. He's having issues logging in to GoToWebinar, so we're trying to troubleshoot that on this end. And I'll let you know when if and when he gets on.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, well then I'll go ahead and start. Can everybody see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So I can't tell what you guys are seeing, but I can only see what I see. So thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, commissioners. For the record, my name is Brett Henry. I'm the Parks Division Manager for Lane County. And this presentation is going to be given in two parts. So I'll start with part one and really just kind of go over a background of Lane County Parks and give you kind of an idea of the current budget constraints that we have. Okay, so this slide basically tells you what I'm going to talk about. So we're going to discuss the Lane County Park System. We're going to talk about the geography, the footprint, all the residents that we serve, the facilities within the park system. And then I will take you way back to the beginning and kind of give you a perspective of how Lane County Parks have been funded since the 50s. Next, I'll talk about our current revenue sources, and then we'll talk about what is the cost of parks and looking facility by facility at that. And then I'll give you an idea of our operating and capital budget. And so you can kind of see what we're working with right now. And then of course, we talked about it last week, so I'm only going to touch on it a bit. I'll talk about deferred maintenance, what that is and why it's so costly and it accumulates so fast. And then I'll close with a discussion about the budget that I believe, as well as others in the task force, should actually be for Lane County Parks. So what do we actually need to operate and maintain our parks? So kind of reminded by the 2018 Parks and Open Space Master Plan, where it talks about sea to summit. And so we absolutely literally have parks from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Cascade Mountains. 68 properties in total, almost 4,400 acres, 5 campgrounds, 3 marinas, numerous boat ramps. And something that we really provide the public that's kind of unique is just access to so many different water systems, from the Willamette River to the McKenzie River, Siuslaw, and even access to the Pacific Ocean and the lakes as well. So a lot of access to water. So what we're seeing is an increase in visitation. So these numbers on this slide were taken back from 2018 through 2021. And you can see that from the number of day use and season passes that have been sold, that there is a pretty marked increase in visitation at our parks. And that even increased more after, or actually in the pandemic. So looking at the summer of 2022 or 2020, from March all the way through October, our recreation season, we saw a record number of people out of our parks. And so Mount Pisgah or Howard Buford Recreation Area, for example, typically sees between 400,000 to 500,000 visitors a year. When we had the car counter data up there, we actually were seeing upwards of 700,000. So it's a huge increase of visitors. I think people want to get away. They want to get outside and recreate and enjoy the outdoors. So we're seeing a lot more of that. And then the last bullet point, really talking about camping reservations. I'll touch on that a bit later, but that's a really important revenue stream for us. And fortunately for us, we're seeing more camping reservations, but that also means that more people using the parks, there's more maintenance involved, right? So we're seeing camping reservations almost doubling between 2018 and 2020. So to understand better our current funding dilemma, I think we need to look back at the past. So starting from the 1950s, really through the 1970s, that was a time of a lot of growth with the Lane County Park System. It was just getting established. Parks were being acquired and rapidly developed. And so there was a steady source of revenue, the timber revenue, as most of you guys know, as well as, some county general fund, gas tax, and other sources. But there were very few user fees at that point. By the middle of the 1970s, the park system really had ballooned and grown a lot. And in fact, the 35 full-time employees at that time, and to kind of compare it to now, we're sitting at 18.8 full-time employees, so about half that. So in the early 80s, we saw this robust park system, but some of those revenue sources were either depleted or taken away. And so when that happened, income, combined with the Great Recession of the early 80s, in 1982, the county was forced to close all parks. So the two pictures you're seeing there at the bottom on the left is Orchard Point, and that's the concession stand from 1964. You can see kind of, I guess everybody back then was kind of casual. I got the kid there with the shirt off, and but yeah, it's and then if you look at the picture on the right, this is Baker Bay in 1979, and everything looks nice and clean and new and looks great, right? So moving on, then parks were closed. They reopened the next year in 1983. And so what was important is that car rental tax, a portion of car rental tax was dedicated to the park system. So that became about half the operating budget by 2000. And so eventually the county hired a full-time parks manager in 1985. And that parks manager was really in charge of rebuilding the park system. So this individual thought, well, we need to have less reliance on the county general fund and have more user fees. And so from parking fees to, rental fees, it was all kind of established during that time. Also, there was a robust volunteer system that reduced the amount of maintenance costs at parks. And then by the end of the decade, FY 99, really the park system became more streamlined. Down to 59 parks with a very small budget of about $1.5 million and a pretty nice capital improvement budget over $1 million a year. So what are the current revenue sources for Lane County Parks? Looking at this pie chart, this was taken from the adopted budget from fiscal year 20. And you can see that there are a lot of user fees here. So about 45% of our revenue comes from user fees. And the lion's share of that are the camping fees. So about a third of our revenue comes from the camping fees. So you have the 22%, plus you have the 11% here. And the 11% is the RV registration fees that we get from the state. So some other big chunks of revenue, obviously we receive no property taxes, no general fund money, but we do receive some car rental tax and the hotel tax or the transient room tax, a percentage. And those two taxes, the car rental tax and the transient room tax, make up about a quarter of our budget. So you see this other big pie here, reserves, and there's a reason why I put it in revenue. So it's not typically thought of as revenue, but what you'll see is if we have some extra revenue that we don't spend, typically in carryover, that'll be put into reserves. So at the start of fiscal year 2020, we had 18% reserves. So 18% of our budget was in reserves, about 880,000. So the pandemic happened, campgrounds were closed. We saw less of the transient room tax and less the car rental tax. And so parks that had the only fund within the county that was not structurally balanced going into FY21. So we were forced to dip into our reserves, and those got depleted down to 8%. And currently right now we sit at 8%. So if something happens, we're at a point where we don't have a lot of backup reserves. And I want to make that known. So really, when you look at our annual revenue, it's more around 4 million is where our revenue sits. So I just added the reserves in there. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to go ahead and interrupt me and ask me, because I know sometimes you may think of something and forget. So I'm open to that for sure. So what do the parks cost? And so I decided to kind of look at facility by facility. And you can see here, starting with regional parks. Our regional parks are really our largest parks that have the most visitation. And some of those you may know, like our Buford Recreation Area, Mount Pisgah, Armitage, Richardson. And so kind of tallying what those cost, I thought was really important. In looking at these other categories, campgrounds, of course, cost a lot to operate and maintain. Natural areas, not as much, but there is some cost involved. And then marinas and boat landings are about the same. So kind of when you put it all together, it's about $1 million. And so this data was taken from 2015 to 2019. So it's a little bit more now, but that's in the ballpark.
I have a quick question, if I could, on that slide.
Sure.
Are those sort of prorated parts of the operational budget per, so, they're duplicative, right? Armitage is listed twice. So is it the campgrounds prorated out of the total cost of maintaining the property? Can you explain how some of these are duplicated? HBRA is duplicated,
Sure.
et cetera.
Well, for instance, when you look at Armitage, there's the campground, but there's also the day use area. So in my mind, I kind of separated out. So we really looked at what does it cost to operate the campground within Armitage, and what does it cost to operate the rest of it, the day use area.
So the part of Armitage under regional parks is exclusive of the campground area, and the campground part is, okay, great. Thank
Correct.
you.
Yeah, so moving on, those are the cost per facilities, but when you look at our overall operating expenses, it's just shy of 3.4 million. So you also factor in the personnel, the benefits, the materials and services that it takes to maintain our parks, as well as any capital improvements that we may make, and of course capital outlay, any large equipment purchases. So Bob wanted me to try to figure out, like, what should our ideal budget be? We know what it is, we know it needs to be more, but what really should it be? And so I was just kind of searching around, and I realized I was, a member of the National Recreation and Park Association, and I was kind of tooling around, and I found this program called Park Metrics. And so it intrigued me because I thought, well, what happens if I start putting some numbers in there? And what happens is there's a database, and the database is taken from all these different agencies throughout the United States. And so it gives you a way that you can compare your own park agency to other park agencies that are somewhat similar, that have some similar metrics or similar descriptors. And so looking at Lane County parks, we have a certain jurisdiction, we serve a certain number of people, we have our facilities. So entering all that data in, as well as, what's our budget, what's our operating budget, capital, what's our revenue. So all that was put into this database. And what we got was this agency performance dashboard that you see in front of you. That may be kind of hard to see, but the left arrow is pointing to my agency, and that's Lane County Parks. The right arrow is pointing to the median or the middle of all the other comparator park systems. And so you can kind of see what our operating expenditures, our FTE is, our acres, et cetera, are, comparing it to these other park systems. So I'm more of a visual person, so I wanted to put some graphs up, and hopefully you can see them. It's bigger, they're big enough. So the one on top is acres per 1,000 population. So basically per 1,000 people, how many acres are there within your park system. And looking at the left arrow, Lane County Parks has about 11.4. And then these other agencies, you know, they average between, you know, 7.8 to, you know, 10.7. So, you know, we're kind of in the ballpark, but maybe a little bit bigger than the normal park agency. The graph on the bottom shows operating expenditures per acre. We're almost off the chart. You see how low we are down here. So basically per acre, our operating expenditures are just over $1,000. If you look at the other park systems, they average in the $7,000 to $8,000 range. So nearly 8 times as much. The next graph that you're seeing here, operating expenditures per capita. And of course, you would expect to see us at the bottom once again, and we are. We're at $12.45 per capita versus the other agencies that are, again, in the $70 or $80 per capita. So what is our revenue per capita? Again, we're at the bottom, 8.73, $8.73 is our revenue per capita compared to the other agencies that range anywhere from $18 to $26 per capita. Okay, so in summary, the park metrics tool is a really good way to compare your park agency to others that are similar. So how are we doing? How are we performing? And what we're seeing is we have a larger park system, but we have much lower operating expenses and much lower revenue per capita and per acre. So what are the consequences to not having these resources? One of them is postponing maintenance. And we talked about this last week. So what is deferred maintenance? So deferred maintenance happens when you postpone repairs, when you don't have enough of a budget to make the needed repairs at the time, but you just kind of put it away for a rainy day. So it gets backlogged over time. So why does it accumulate so fast? Why is it so costly? It's because, you know, not only is it accumulating, there's infrastructure, there's assets, equipment that are breaking down even more. So we have even more costs, and these continue to just pile up more and more. And then it gets to a point where, you know, you're trying to extend the useful life of all of your assets, and some of it ends up failing. And when we have catastrophic failure, we can have safety issues, and we need to really watch that. So what are our deferred maintenance backlog estimates? So this past year, the Parks Division hired Faithful and Gould to conduct a facility condition assessment. Now, we wanted to do a facility condition assessment for the entire park system, all 68 parks. But like everything else, we didn't have the budget to do so. So I really had to hone in kind of on that first tier of parks that have the most built infrastructure. So we looked at Armitage, Baker Bay, Orchard Point, and Richardson Parks. And so this assessment really blew me out of the chair when I saw the results. The deferred maintenance backlog for just those 4 parks out of 68 is almost $16 million. And if we don't make any investments over the next 10 years, that is slated to grow to over 27 million. So Bob was curious about, like, what is our overall deferred maintenance for our entire park system? And so how could we potentially extrapolate that, or, you know, how could we kind of figure what that may be? And so I then spoke with Mr. Dean Leonard with Faithful and Gould and said, you know, if I can give you as much data as possible for the other 64 parks, meaning how many parking lots, how many trails, how many restrooms, etc., can you give me a high-level estimate for our deferred maintenance backlog? And he said, I'll try. He got back a couple of days later, and he gave us this figure, $56 million. Now, that's very high level, and we plan on doing some more assessments when we have more budget available. But we can probably safely say that it's anywhere between 40 and $70 million, and with 56 being our best estimate at this time. So, looking at this chart here, this is the budget required to properly operate and maintain our parks. The column on the left is your budget source, from your personnel to your operating costs, your expenses, and then what is our target goal? What's our net funding goal? The column in the middle are the fiscal year 21 actuals. And then the column on the right is the budget that we believe is required, the annual budget to maintain and operate our parks. Now, it needs to be noted that the deferred maintenance backlog was not figured into this yet. Now, Bob will talk more about that in his presentation and some of the funding plans. They have that incorporated into it. So we're just talking about just operating our parks. And so I used park metrics. It was very helpful for this exercise, but it doesn't give me the whole picture. So I had a couple of meetings with my staff. I have a maintenance lead that's been here almost 30 years. And then I have another park supervisor that's also worked for Lane County Parks for almost 30 years. And they really provided me insight into what they thought they needed to properly maintain the parks. And so, looking at personnel, adding an additional 11 full-time employees. Now, we only have right now 7 full-time employees that are out in the field that actually conduct maintenance at our parks. Now, we do have seasonals that we hire, but a lot of our seasonals, lack experience. They come in, do a great job, but we really need more full-time employees out in the field doing the work. And in the office, we're not fully staffed. We need another 3 full-time employees in the office. I wear a lot of hats, as does the rest of our office staff. So we really need that. So adding another 11, that would give us 29.8. And don't ask me why it's 0.8. I mean, I know why, but that's kind of strange. So we actually have one employee, does a wonderful job, but he is a 0.8. He's not a full-time. And so, when you add these personnel costs, we looked at our materials and services budget. We realized that, we're going to need more of that to maintain our parks, right? We're going to need more money for, tools and equipment and supplies and all that. So we put that together, and then you get your overall operating costs. Add the personnel in, that's 5.8 million. Okay, so then you take the revenue. And, you saw the slide before, our revenue, you take the taxes out, you take the transit room tax, the hotel tax, and you take the car rental tax out, which is approximately $1 million. We're left with about $3 million that we can generate mainly through user fees. And so then you subtract that out, and our net funding goal is 2.8 million. So that's our target goal at this point, not factoring in deferred maintenance. And again, Bob will talk more about that later. Yeah, so you guys have any questions, feel free to stop me. I do want to summarize and just say that I appreciate this opportunity. I think, I was hired about 3.5 years ago, and I've had tons of support from my boss. Dan Hurley's a wonderful director, Public Works. Steve Morkahysky, obviously, is wonderful. Hopefully we can keep him. Hopefully he stays here. He's wonderful. And then, of course, all the commissioners, and getting to meet you guys, even new commissioners, Laurie and Joe and Heather. I want to make sure that it's just understood, though, that we're at a point, we're at a critical juncture to where we have systems that are failing, and we provide a wonderful resource to the public. And this is really our opportunity to get some more sustainable funding to continue to have these parks, that are clean, green, and that are thriving into the future. So thank you very much. I'm going to now pass it over to Mr. Kiefer, and he's going to give part 2 of this presentation.
So can all of you hear me?
Yep.
I've been muted all this time. I've been quiet. It's not my normal thing when it comes to talk about parks. For the record, I'm Bob Kiefer. I'm a senior consultant with the Special Districts Association of Oregon, former superintendent at Willamette Lane Park and Recreation District, and as Steve mentioned, also the parks manager for Lane County I think he put, Brett put in the slide, the rebirth of the park system, and that was during my time frame. I don't know if we ever fully got rebirth, but we sure started making some headway. So I appreciated that introduction from Steve and from Brett. And commissioners, I just want to say thank you to each of you for your service. Last week, when I listened to the deferred maintenance study, and before that, the issue with land use, it reminded me of my days at the county and how complex of a job you have of balancing all the needs of a county residents. And I hope today, as we give this, that you will consider parks as an important service that the county provides our residents in Lane County. So I'm going to try to cover for you in a very short while at the end of the day, the recommendations of the task force. And as I mentioned to each of you individually, this was a long process. I've been working on this project for 2 years, and we brought a lot of information to the table for the task force to review, to look at, to assess, and help us come to the recommendations. Next slide, please. So here's all the things I'm going to cover. I don't need to go over that right now. We'll just get right to it. The next slide, please. So again, as a reminder, and as what Steve told you, this really drives from the approval of the Lane County Parks and Open Space Master Plan in 2018. And I just want to keep that in mind, because what I heard from all of you and heard from the task force is that you do not want to keep this Parks Master Plan on the shelf. And by looking to the task force and looking to the work that's been accomplished, you want to see this implemented. And I was encouraged by that. If I met with each of you individually before we started, except for Commissioner Traeger, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to do that at that time, but I was concerned, as you will remember, are we going to put this effort in and leave this on the shelf? And each of you confirmed to me that no, this is important. So I'm thankful for that. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I really want to point out to you the master plan vision, which I think are some key words here. And right up front is thriving. So our thriving parks and natural areas connect us to our rivers, our reservoirs, our natural features, showcase our heritage and cultural diversity, and protect resources for future generation. Thriving tells me you want to do better than you are today. You want your parks to be a place that people want to come to. It's a demand. They want it. They're there because they want to, and otherwise they're not thriving. They're just there. And so that's an important part of the funding plan as well. And then the last two words, and you could, future generations, there's really concern here about what do we do in the future for our community. And it's not just protecting those resources, I believe. I believe it's the entire fabric of the services we provide in parks. Next slide, please. So as a reminder, and as Steve mentioned and Brett mentioned, our sole goal was to evaluate and recommend dedicated funding options that ensure long-term financial stability for the park system. When we get down to the end of the day, you may ask us, is this really stable funding, sustainable? I believe it is because it builds some time for us to continue to look at additional resources. We'll get to that in a moment. This sort of the time frame, as I mentioned, it's been 2 years for me involved in the process. And then the task force was appointed in December of 2019. We met first in February of 2020. Commissioner Buck, thank you for coming to that initial meeting and supporting the task force. That was helpful. But that was our only in-person meeting. We had hoped even in July that we were going to be able to pull off an outdoor meeting and be able to do everything, but we had the spike in the COVID pandemic, and so we had to do our last meeting online. And quite frankly, I was so excited about doing it. I had made a reservation at Armitage Park and was camping there and sitting in the parks office there, facilitating that meeting. That's how hopeful I was that we would be able to meet again. So our last meeting was, like I said, in July of 21. Next slide, please. So again, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because I have reviewed all this, and I know that you've got the full funding plan and the executive summary and read through the material, but I wanted to be able to just highlight some of this. First of all, the first thing we asked the task force to do was, what are our funding priorities based on the master plan, based on what our needs are within our park system from the information that the task force received from Brett. And thirdly, and just as important, these were all citizens in the community coming from all different perspectives. What's important to you? And through a priority process, we came up with these top 5 priorities. The long-term funding for park maintenance and operation. Take care of what we got. That is first on the list. We need to take care of what we got, just as you would at your home. Hopefully, before you put an addition onto your home, you're taking care of what you got. We have to address this multi-million-dollar backlog. We did not know what it was when we started in February of 2020. Commissioner Bosevich, you mentioned it was $16 million when you first started on this discussion. And I think I heard 17 million, but we really didn't know what that backlog was. We have a better idea today, but we need to verify that. So we need to take care of that. The whole idea of enhancing our ability to pursue and implement conservation and habitat restoration projects was a big part of what was in the master plan, along with providing environmental and cultural education programs. Those were things that were additions within the master plan that I think are outstanding. And when I think about the education programs, I think about how we begin to connect with our community. This is an opportunity for us to do that. And then lastly, was to focus on projects that generate net revenue. And this is really the task force saying, there are some things that we can do to help ourselves, and we should be looking at those in the future and take advantage of those as we go. Next slide, please. We then looked at service priorities, and I'm not going to go much down into details. These are all very common things that we've been doing for years at county parks. Probably the one surprise that I saw on the list of current services that was so high on top was recreational vehicle camping. But again, it goes back to the last statement that I said about let's trying to take care of ourselves. We know that recreation vehicle camping, when it's done right and meets state standards, we receive significant revenue from those efforts. And if any of you have tried to reserve a campsite at Harbor Vista or Richardson or Armitage within a 4 or 5 month period, you can almost count that things are going to be full. When I made that, I was so surprised I was able to get into Armitage. I think there was 3 sites left. Somebody must have canceled, and I got one of them. Otherwise, I couldn't get into Richardson. So it is one of the things that the task force was very interested in. I was also interested in these the potential new services that came again right out of the master plan of environmental education, summer camps, special events, and outdoor recreation activities. These all received the same amount of votes, so they were all number 1. But I want to point to you, and this is something that sort of came to me in the last couple of days as I've been thinking about this. All these things are about creating relationships with our citizens. Every one of them invite us into our parks and invite people to have interactions with our facilities and our staff and to be part of the county. So when we do that, that creates ownership, that creates a relationship with the county. I think this is a very positive thing that the task force picked up on that we may never maybe discussed as much as we should have. Next slide, please. We talked a little bit about cost recovery, and the key here for you as a commission is to understand that the task force supports this idea. The greater the individual benefit, the higher the cost recovery. What that really means is the less subsidy we should provide that facility or that service or that program if it has a high individual benefit. However, those things that we have traditionally done, those natural areas, access, day use, trails, that's really a community benefit, and we should not expect it to recover all of its direct cost. Whereas mortgage and camping and lessons and activities and food concessions are highly individual, and we should be recovering more than our direct cost, close to 150%. It's examples, it's a philosophy, and if you're going to go down this road and really look at this, I would encourage the county to do a complete study of this methodology and hire the appropriate consultant to help you. In your plan, there is an example from Coconino County in Arizona, and also the Willamette Lane cost recovery model in your packet. So it's something for you to look at if you're more interested in that. Next slide. Just as a reminder, this was a funnel. This is a lot of information that the task force was absorbing over this time, and you're trying to absorb in the next, in 10 minutes. So I appreciate you hanging in there with me. We looked at funding options by category of service. What are we doing? These work units that we have: operation and maintenance, deferred maintenance, conservation habitat, environmental education, and revenue generating projects, which also grew into special projects. And we looked at each one of these a little differently because they may have different needs. Deferred maintenance may be a lot of one-time money that we need to put in right up front and less later. So how does your funding mechanism work different than an operations and maintenance, which has to be consistent over time so you know what you have so that you can take care of the resources. Conservation habitat could be some consistency money, but it may need some grant and one-time money to match grants, those type of things. The same as environmental education. And revenue generating, maybe it's a one-time shot toward with some economic development funds of some sort. So it was all different types of different resources looked at. And again, I have to refer to the funding plan for a complete description of all those we looked at. The next slide gives you an example of the most important one that we looked at, and the most complex is just a funding source summary for operations and maintenance. And you can see down the list, I think there's 5 there. If I'm looking at 5, and everything from a local option levy to a transfer room tax, a utility fee, county service district, solid waste fee increase. All these things have their pros and cons. How much would it take to, based on certain assumptions, would it take to meet a target of $3.5 to $4.5 million? Because that was the target we were working at in the spring before we got the refined numbers from Brett. So we were looking at all those different, and then what are some of the pros and cons of each? What we know about the utility fee in the county service district, those would all be new, different for the public to absorb in the county. The county service district would probably also require us, I know it would require us to do some legislative fix. Otherwise, we'd be impacting the other service districts in the county. These are long-term sources that we'd have to develop, have to build relationships with, and we're in a need right now to do something much quicker than that. So again, I'm not going to go over each one. You've had this information, and you can ask me questions about it at any point as at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. You all also told me that it was important for the community, for us to survey the community, see what they felt about the parks and about funding the parks. And again, in the funding plan, there's the full report from the research group that helped us, FM3. In the back, in the appendix, you can see the whole report. Here's some key findings here, and I'm going to add one more, Brett. I'm sorry I didn't add this earlier, but first of all, parks have a favorable view in our community. That's good to know. 7 and 10 said they feel like there's some need for funding. Again, very interesting. In principle, 59% 59% support increasing funding to maintain and improve parks. And that's before we gave them any push questions. What if it was for this or what was for that? It was just a general, what do you think? And as I mentioned to each of you, I think that one of the most important things is that we need to get people in our parks. We need to build those relationships with them, because when they visit a park a few times a year, they're more likely to support us with any funding. The fourth item that I think is important here that's not on there is we also learned through that survey that folks were a lot more comfortable with traditional sources of revenue like the local option levy than they were at looking at a utility tax or forming a county service district, something that they weren't very much aware of, didn't want to create a new tax. Of course, I have to say in that, to be honest, that they also, as a public, said, well, why don't we just tax the tourists more? More transit room tax, let's let somebody else pay for it. What you heard from the task force is that's not equitable. That's not fair. We all need to make some investment in it. But I guess it's like everybody likes a tax that I don't have to pay if I get the benefit from it. So that was one other thing that came out of that. Next slide, please. Again, I don't have to do much here because Brett's already explained all this. Net subsidy just to operate and maintain the budget without deferred maintenance, without any additional services, $2.8 million. You can see that, it's very quick. Next. So the deferred maintenance side, you already heard this, 16 right now on those 4 parks, 27 over 10 years, we don't do anything. You can look at this revetment. I would guess that that's Orchard Point or Perkins. What is that, Brett?
That's Orchard Point.
You know what? That's the way it looked 25 years ago. We still haven't made any, we had the same issue back then. Next slide. So when we looked at all our parks and also had this rough estimate from Faithful and Gould, their estimate was around $15 million right now that's needed in the rest of the parks. And if we wait, it's going to be almost double that, 29 million in 10 years. So when we combine those two reports, and can't really call it a report, it's Faithful and Gould's best estimate based on the knowledge that they have. It's $31 million deferred maintenance cost today across the park system, $31 million. And that grows to 56 million as Brett expressed in his slide. Probably the most important, not most important, but one of the important things is that we need to do additional assessments. This task force really is recommending we do that very soon so that we can verify as much as we can what our deferred maintenance is in the rest of our park system. Next slide. So funding targets by categories, these were what the task force came up with as we were going through this process. $2.8 million a year for operation and maintenance, provide a minimum of $2 million annually to address the multi-million-dollar backlog of deferred maintenance, provide $500,000 annually for projects associated with conservation, habitat restoration, and to support matching grants. Next slide. Provide $200,000 annually to support education programs and natural resource-oriented parks. This could be partnerships with some of our great partners out there, the Friends of Buford Park, the Mount Pisgah Arboretum, OSU Extension Service, Mackenzie River Trust, others. We could partner with other organizations to do a lot of this. We also, in the master plan, it talks about additions of outdoor classrooms and interpretive facilities within our parks. That could be something we could do with these funds. And then the last 2 items are really projects. The task force was really interested in seeing what could we do in some of these areas that would be beneficial to specific communities, like restoring the Mackenzie River parks after the Holiday Farm fire. What is it that we can do up there? Rivers to Ridges Parks and Open Space Vision implementation. That has been something that the county has been involved with the other partners in the Eugene Springfield area for years, for probably 25 years. How can we have some projects within that? Maybe it's trail connections between Pisgah and Springfield, or the Lane Community College Basin. You can see those type of things, but one of the neat things about that is it could also increase tourism. I just read in the tourism report for Travel Lane County that for every dollar that is invested into, how does it say? It says every dollar invested in tourism related marketing, capital projects, and operational support results in a $51 return. These type of projects would do that type of thing. They would have quite a return in our community. And then revenue generation projects, again, we would determine those depending on the funding sources that that the county moves ahead with for the county park system. Next. So we looked at 3 funding alternatives. A was a sort of a traditional funding strategy. It generates $7.5 million annually with a $6 million 5-year local option levy. It includes $1.5 million from the car rental tax and TRT, transient room tax, and the general fund, requesting $500,000 from the general fund to support parks, in addition to the car rental tax and the transient room tax. The property tax rate on that $6 million local option levy, based on last year's overall county assessed value for a $225,000 assessed home, is $37.30 a year, or 16.5 cents a thousand. So that 225 is the median priced assessed value home in Lane County. Next slide, please. We also looked at an alternative that would be more just the county commission initiated fees and taxes that you could do if you decided without the vote of the people. And this particular proposal generates $6 million annually. Based on the assumption that there's 190,000 electric accounts throughout the county, it would take about $1.45 per month to support this proposal. We would request that the solid waste disposal fees be increased by $4 a ton, or 4.2%. We would have to increase park user fees. The one thing that we did put in the plan was we would not be looking at increasing day use fees, but how about picnic fees, moorage fees, camping fees, any other special fees that we have, and also look at what could we do to implement some cost saving measures, if that means closing some parks or doing some other things to transfer money to the other facilities. And we would also ask that the county commission consider increasing the transient room tax by 0.5%. We know there's a lot of folks looking at that transient room tax, and it's just one of many that would be looking at those resources. Again, we would plan on the county continue with the CRT, the TRT, and providing $500,000 additional general fund support to the park system. Alternative C, next slide. Sort of a combined initiative. Again, it's $6 million with a $3.5 million local option levy. That would be less than 10 cents a thousand, about $22 a year for a typical home in Lane County. Again, we'd request that the general fund, or we'd plan on the general fund and the CRT to amount to about $1.5 million. Those were the 3 alternatives they evaluated and looked at. And next, that got us to where are we at with final recommendations. First of all, if there wasn't anything else you get out of my presentation today, the task force is recommending to the county commission that we look to fund at minimum $6 million annually for the Parks Division for revenues outside of what they generate themselves to support the entire operation. And again, maintain the car rental tax and transfer room tax for the Parks Division, approximately $1 million a year. I think Brett's slide showed 1.2 million at one point came from those 2 sources, but we're saying $1 million. The task force recommends that the county general fund invest $500K additional discretionary funds to the Parks Division. And this fourth bullet could have got lost in the plan. But again, with this theme of how can we help ourselves, we should be looking at how we can partner better with our federal partners, federal agencies out there that are running similar types of facilities, campgrounds. In Lynn County, they've been able to take over many of the federal Forest Service campgrounds up to South San Em, generating them a net $100,000 a year to support their operation. So we need to be talking to our folks as well. What could we do there? Next slide. The task force recommends in this fiscal year that we're in right now, fiscal year 22, that $100,000 be set aside to complete a facility assessment at 13 additional parks. We list the parks in the report. That by doing that, we would have a much better handle on what our deferred maintenance is for our most significant parks. We could verify that number and refine what is our need for deferred maintenance. We've already had conversations with the county administrator about that and would hopefully find the funding to do that this year. Also in fiscal year 22, we were hoping, requesting that the county support providing $250,000 toward feasibility analysis, engineering, design on those 4 major parks that we talked about earlier: Armitage, Baker Bay, Orchard Point, and Richardson. There are significant infrastructure needs there in potable water, in sewage systems, in irrigation, and in asphalt that need to be addressed. And if we could get ahead of the game and invest at least in studies right now, if not full construction projects in there, possibly, is there a possibility of using ARPA funds for that now versus waiting? That would be helpful. I know that you're going to have future discussions about that, and that you are all looking at that as a possibility for multiple projects and needs in the county. Again, I don't do this in isolation. I understand there's a lot going on, but the county parks also has a need to get ahead of the game here. The task force recommends and supports alternative A, as you could probably imagine. We've talked about that. I think you can put those dollars wherever you need to put those dollars. We just assign some of those dollars from different sources to those different tasks. Go back one, please. What? Nope, wrong way. Right there. Brett, I want to go back to that previous slide. I just want to make a point. Okay. You can see where the task force has said, okay, deferred maintenance, just use $2.7 million in levy funds and $300K from general funds. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter where those funds come from. As long as we receive those type of dollars to make the investments that need to occur in the parks. This was just to give an example. With this example, what I think is unique is the $1 million for revenue and special projects really come from funds that would enhance tourism, or transfer room tax and CRT really come from outside folks, and would turn around, would reinvest those dollars into projects that would be tourism related. Next slide now. I know Brett's trying to move me along, so he moves those slides ahead before I'm ready. So the public, here's why we want alternative A. First of all, it's within the realm of possibilities as far as the public opinion survey told us, that folks were comfortable up to $60, more likely in this $30 to $40, they'd be more willing to support that type of investment on an annual basis. The levies are familiar with voters. Once passed, the 5-year local option levies are predominantly renewed by voters. Look at the sheriff's levy, OSU extension. Most of the fire districts have done this. It is something, once you show your folks what you are capable of doing and then making the improvements you say you're going to do, and you tell them about it, they generally renew. And also, this gives us a period to really investigate and fully examine the other funding sources we've talked about in the plan. Next.
Hey, Bob, I just want to make sure we're past our presentation time, so I want to make sure we wrap it up quick here.
I am right at the end. Okay, sorry. Lot to cover. Provide Alternative A cuts the backlog in half within 5 years if we were able to accomplish it. We are able to put $500K toward habitat restoration, which is significant and is also in line with the master plan. And the education piece is also funded without dependent upon taking money within the existing budget to get it done. Next. So last recommendations here. We need to do an additional public opinion survey before we put any type of option out for the citizens to consider. We want to know how viable is this idea, find out what the best messaging would be. We need to complete some special project listing, determine what are we going to do with the funds in the areas of deferred maintenance, revenue, and special projects before we go out to the voters. They really need to know what are they going to get for their dollars. And then we need to look at some cost reductions if possible, mostly in the way that we operate a robust volunteer program and look at a potential disposal of surplus properties. As I mentioned to all of you before, a lot of those properties may not impact us very much right now, but in the future, it could be a significant asset for us to do. And then lastly, we need to, and I've talked about this to each of you, we need to really look at marketing our park system and letting people be aware of the assets we have, how great they are, but what our need is as well. Okay. Sorry it took long. I tried to cover a lot in a short amount of time. This is where we turn it over to you, Chair Bernie, but what's missing? What questions do you have? What do you need from us for us to move ahead? We're planning to continue to do the rest of this work we were talking about, the deferred maintenance additional study, looking at the projects, refining that list, and then refining our budgets and all that over the next 6 months or so, and hopefully come back to you as a commission and in June with a full-fledged, here's how we should go next, utilizing our Park Advisory Committee to be the screening element for that. Chair Bernie, I turn it to you.
Chair, we can't hear you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Not that you were complaining. Mr. Henry, Mr. Kiefer, we know how important this is. We know how important it is to you. You've had conversations with all of us individually. We've talked about this last week. We've now gone over the entire time that was estimated for presentation and discussion. So we do have an executive committee this afternoon. So while this is important and while we will have questions and respond, we are fighting the clock right now. So commissioners, have at it. Mr. Kiefer eloquently articulated the questions he'd like input on. Commissioner Buck.
I'll start by just sharing my personal appreciation to the entire committee who's been working so hard on this particular report. There's a lot in here to digest. And I know that those were challenging discussions on a challenging subject. And you could be doing anything else with your time, but you all have passion regarding parks, and I sincerely appreciate that. I appreciate having one-on-one with you and being able to go over this at a cursory level in advance of the meeting today. That was really helpful for me to understand everything that's that you're trying to present. And I know for the public, they may need to chew on this a little bit because there was so much presented today. I'm very supportive of everything that you have done and will absolutely consider the recommendations that you presented here today, and know that there is another 6 months of work for you to do before you come back to us as a board to actually move forward on any particular levy or motion to move forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Yes, Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. I'll echo everything Commissioner Buck just said and just add that I think, deferred maintenance, right, is making it challenging for us to protect our investments, and we need to do that. And that increased park use is a double-edged sword in that we can love our parks to death. And I think the pandemic in particular has taken a real toll in a good way. More and more people really relied on getting outside, disengaging from being on screens all day. And really, I now see them as sort of a linchpin of our mental health system in a way, really, how a lot of people are particularly now using our parks. So I think we're really well positioned in that there is nothing like a global pandemic to heighten communities' awareness of a public health entity, as well in this case as a park system and the role that it plays in helping people stay sane and healthy in such a challenging time. And also with the increasing urgency around climate mitigation, our parks are really sort of our crown jewel and a place where we're protecting and preserving open spaces and green spaces and tree canopy and clean waterways and so on. So I just think we're at a really important and good confluence of the county and the community working together to protect these beautiful parks. So thank you for your work, for your presentation. Very supportive and looking forward to next steps.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, Vice Chair Farr.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. A great presentation. Could go on for 2 hours or 3 hours, but unfortunately there are so many hours only so many hours in the day. And in order for us to have any hope of getting through our complete agenda, I'm going to defer my questions. Other than I'm going to say this, I do support the discussion regarding the funding that we're going to have. I believe we have some time on the agenda next week, even, Chair Bernie. Is that correct?
I believe it's the week after next.
It is the week after next. Thank you. And then, I'm looking forward to the discussion. I do support further. I do support funding the completion of the study on the 4 parks, and a continuing study with was it 13 more parks. Really to get an accurate picture of what it is that we need for the park system for the future. Alas, we don't have our traditional funding sources. Many of us wish we still had those sources. We don't, so we have to seek something new. I'm in favor of it. I use Lane County Parks. I buy 2 annual passes a year and use them on a regular basis. I'm fully in favor, Mr. Henry, of your work, and I'd love to get those 11 additional FTEs for you, because every time I go to the park, whether it's with a guest, whether it's with my family, they always say, why aren't you taking care of that bridge? What's wrong with this concrete? You see that rebar sticking out right there? We do need to take care of it. You have a full supporter from this commissioner. Thank you.
I wish you all could see the way Commissioner Bozovich looks at me when I don't call on him. It's only because I can't see with the small squares, but boy, I see those eyes staring. Yes, Commissioner Bozovich.
Actually, I'd raised my hand after Commissioner Farr, so.
Oh, okay. So I'm clear on
you're
this.
fine. Yeah, you're good. First, I would just ask if I could get the full community survey report from FM3, because I see 6 responses on the most serious problem question, but I didn't know if there are more options given to people to rank and where the rest of them fell. And I don't need to hear about that now, but if I can actually dive into the survey data and how the questions were asked a little bit more, it'll give me a broader understanding. I will say this, I do understand the need for funding. I do understand the deferred maintenance as an engineer, but I've been around the county for a long time doing budgets, and I explained this last week. This is in comparison to everything else in our system that's in dire need. And I want an additional survey work done to understand how asking people for money for parks is going to impact our ability to re-up our jail and youth services levy, which is so critical to our public safety system right now. I want to understand how it's going to impact our ability to possibly go out for matching bonding funds for new courthouse, which is a critical facility needed in this county. Not as popular as parks, but if we go out for parks and use up that goodwill, and then we can't renew our jail levy, and we're back to having, making national news for people we just released from our jail killing people, we're not going to put very many people in our parks, And I just remind the board, we have a public safety repair plan that shows we need 5.12 million a year to get our patrol services up to even a ghost of what they once were, and another 2.88 million a year to put a traffic enforcement team on the streets on a regular basis to deal with the carnage that's happening on our highways. And we're also talking about a stormwater fee. We have to put all this in context. And yeah, there's a great need in our park system. But frankly, in 2010, when we were making a 20% cut to our budget, we were considering yanking all the funding out of parks and putting it in other places and going back to 1982 and shutting the system down. Because there's some things we do in this county that rise to a level of higher need for the community than parks, believe it or not. Public safety, housing people, health services, there's a few things that we do that's kind of pretty high. And if you look at that one question they have in the polling, what rose to the highest level of concern for our citizens? Homelessness, economic impact of the coronavirus outbreak, and the cost of housing. Parks wasn't in there. Now, I don't know if they asked a question about parks because I don't have the full list, but that's what's top of mind for our citizens. So I just, with all that said, I'll continue, looking into this, but I just want to say I've got to put it in context of all of the needs of the county.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Mr. Henry, Ms. McCoy, especially because you're chairing a volunteer task force, and this is huge. And, that commitment can't be underscored. So thank you. And obviously, Mr. Kiefer. And please don't let, they've burdened me with time management as chair. Don't let my pointing out the time management issue think in any way that reflects a lack of support for what you're trying to do. I think Commissioner Bozovich's point is true, which is that we are seeing such a disinvestment in so many aspects of the public interest right now, that this body is being hit with many. Now, having said that, as an ex-Lane ESD school board member, I also think that environmental education and getting kids off their screens and into nature is so critical that we may be embarking on a new, and with some, depending upon how these federal funds sort themselves out, we may be embarking in a new era of fundamentally more substantive partnerships with our public schools and with education that may even be part of an answer as it relates to funding here. So I'm going to encourage that we look at that, and that we look at the possibility that some type of relationship there, climate, resources, this being a resource-based county, at least in its history, it has been, there may be some opportunities even above and beyond the funding sources that Mr. Kiefer articulated. Because here's the problem, all of those sources are the only sources we have to tap for all the other things that are hitting us right now. So I absolutely believe in our parks. I think that that's quality of life. I think it affects everything from mental health to, sadly, the value of real estate here, because the value of real estate's out of hand already. And I'm very much looking forward. I believe you're scheduled for us to be looking at the dollars more carefully in 2 weeks at this board's agenda. And, I'm supportive of trying to figure this thing out with you. Keith, I don't think you answered any of your questions. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Brett.
I'm sorry. Do you want us to come back in 2 weeks? And what do you want to discuss at that time?
Well, wait a minute. Ms. Jones, what did we discuss at agenda setting this morning?
So I'm happy to take this, Chair. I think initially Parks had asked to come back in the next couple weeks, but I believe the feeling now is, given some of the additional work that is going to be done, I believe we are going to return to the board in June. Is that right, Brett? So we're going to return to the board unless the board would like to have additional information or further this discussion. We certainly could bring back a continuation of this discussion in 2 weeks, but I don't think we're planning on having anything new or specifically seeking direction from you in 2 weeks.
What was it we were discussing in agenda session this morning? Diana.
Again, we thought that we would. I think.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What's that?
I was asking Diana, but go ahead, Steve.
Oh, okay.
No, go ahead.
Oh, do you want me to? Chair Bernie, it was a miscommunication between Public Works, and originally we had planned on bringing this back on the 26th, and then a discussion was held later, and I found out that this wasn't going to be coming back until June, and they cleared that up with me after agenda setting. So the item we did discuss this morning in agenda setting, once Mr. Henry got direction from you, he was going to coordinate a date with me to get it back on the agenda, and it probably will be sometime around June. Brett can correct me if I'm misspeaking.
Brett, are you good with that?
Yeah, I'm fine with that. It looks like Bob wants to say something.
Please, Bob, I'm sorry.
I just think that you should build in some flexibility. It may be that there's a benchmark where we come back in February and March with some information before we finalize a plan. There's an update on deferred maintenance. There's some project lists that we've developed. I would like to just make sure that the commission is open to having an interim report or at least a memo that's received about an update before June, because June's a long ways away. In light of what we heard from Commissioner Bosevich, how we're planning on proceeding with things, I think it's important. So I just would hope you would have that open in your agenda.
Commissioners, I have no problem with that. Does anyone? Okay.
Okay, so hopefully we can get a little bit of money to do another deferred maintenance study. We talked about those 13 parks, so we'd have a better, more refined figure for the entire park system, deferred maintenance. And so maybe we could provide an update on that at that time in June in a report or a memo.
Okay. Very good. Is there anything else for the good of the order? We are running a little behind. I do apologize to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
We are now on item 12, a discussion on update on the progress and goals of the creation of an equity lens for Lane County. And the group presenting I have here, although I see Mr. Rickoff, is the Equity Lens Subcommittee. So Mr. Rickoff, however you want to proceed.
All right. Thank you, Chair Bernie, Commissioners. I'm hoping that our team will be filing in here. It's been important to us that we really, since we have worked so constructively as a team, that we do want to continue to model that work. So this is your update on the equity lens. Somebody wants to jump to the next screen. Our purpose today is to provide an update on the lens, the progress we've made, the pilot projects where the lens has been used, and then to really have a discussion with you on your thoughts and how the lens might benefit your work as leaders. So this is going to be your chance for feedback. Next slide. Just a quick reminder of who we are. My name is Greg Rickoff. I'm the Director of Operations in County Administration.
Tina Inman with H&HS.
Christy, are you there?
Sorry, Krista Noble, Assessment and Taxation.
Luke Arnold, Developmental Disabilities.
Mackenzie Neal, Youth Services and HHS.
Mo Young, County Admin and Public Health.
And I believe Nevada will not be with us today. Okay. Sarah?
Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Salisbury with the Quality and Compliance Division at HNHS.
And I'm Tekla Evanuk with Lane County Public Works.
So our progress to date, as you know, we've created an Equity Lens toolkit, and that toolkit has 3 options for plans of application. There's a brief 1-page tool, an expanded 2-page tool, and then 10 situation-specific or area-specific applications that we've developed. We have the ability to modify the Equity Lens toolkit going forward, which we have continued to do as we have trialed it. We've made the draft Equity Lens tools and the Equity Lens toolkit available on the Lane County website, and they are available electronically and through an app as well in paper and printed versions. We've developed feedback from an electronic form for feedback to gather information on formal and informal trial projects that we have done. We began trialing the Equity Lens, and we continue to update it as we do get those cognito forms and that feedback back from those trialed applications. Continued progress to date, we began discussing the complexity of the implementation and organization organization-wide, my apologies, and just looked at ongoing training and resourcing that we're going to need, potential barriers to staff participation and engagement in using the Equity Lens, and the need for data to inform the focus and prioritizing of the Equity Lens rollout. We also have started a video orientation that's in development and will be made available on Leap for employees, as well as on the Equity Lens website.
So you'll see on this slide the many places that we have already tested the Equity Lens. Some of the bigger projects are community vaccination and access, rental assistance, during this COVID-19 pandemic, holiday farm fire recovery, climate action plan, and more. Unless you think that we only can use it on large projects, we've also used it on some smaller projects. And we are learning and changing and updating as we go in real time.
So moving forward, we've identified several ongoing goals related to implementing the lens. The first involves staff training, which includes supporting and advocating for consistent foundational equity training. We're aware that supervisors and managers need to be grounded first, so we plan to take this to a supervisor meeting and use breakout sessions, to practice using the lens. This goal also involves orienting and training staff on the mechanics of using the lens, so they know how to apply it to different projects and settings. Another goal around implementing the lens is to remove and reduce barriers to using the lens, to be clear about the expectations and frequency of use, and to provide adequate resources to fully implement the lens. And finally, there is a need to continue collecting data and feedback and to evaluate the impact of the lens, to adapt it as needed, and to create an accountability system.
I believe you will see attached to the board packet a letter that we've drafted. The letter is intended to be included in the introductory section for the next updated version of the Lane County Equity Lens Toolkit. The letter would probably also be posted on the Lane County Equity Lens website. The letter has been revised and approved by multiple people and groups within the county. We are formally requesting today that the board approve the attached board letter, and that the letter would be signed by the board chair. And then we invite the Board of Commissioners to consider how to apply the equity lens to the work and decisions of the board. We put some examples of what this could possibly mean on this slide. So we are asking basically our entire organization to undergo foundational racial equity training. We would like to invite the Board of County Commissioners into that process. That training is not intended to be something that Lane County employees do in isolation. We're intending it to be in community, in groups, in discussion, so that we can all benefit from each other's shared knowledge. And we'd like to invite the Board of Commissioners to participate in that, both in imparting shared knowledge that the board commissioners have for Lane County employees and others in our community, and also learning from other people who are Lane County employees and in our community who have shared knowledge and experience about equity. We invite the Board of Commissioners to use the equity lens as a core piece during the development of the next Lane County strategic plan, and also to consider applying the equity lens to many different types of board decisions and activities. I think the Board of Commissioners will have probably better ideas on what this could mean than we would, but just in general, any policies, processes, procedures, or programs, really kind of anything that you all think we should use the equity lens to look at, we encourage you to do so. And just in general, we're inviting the Board of Commissioners to consider the potential transformational opportunity for using the equity lens tool. This is intended to be a tool that's part of a process. It should be used, in our view, in multiple decision points, at multiple points during a lot of the complex and sometimes ongoing decision-making processes that the Board of Commissioners and county leadership does. So we just invite you to reflect and kind of begin to discuss amongst yourselves as to what that could mean for the work you do as county commissioners.
With that, I think our presentation is done. Chair Bernie, we'll turn it back to you. And I'm not hearing you, sir.
I apologize. Thank you all very much. I would read each person's name, but there's a lot of people on this Equity Lens subcommittee. So rather than that, with respect to all, do commissioners have any questions or comments? Yes, Commissioner Buck, in your role of beginning most of our discussions today.
I'm just trying to keep things moving.
No, I appreciate it.
I appreciate all the work that's going into this. You've got support from me, full support along the way. I really appreciate the way that you're rolling it out too. And starting with those pilot projects who look like they've been very successful so far, and getting responses from our workers, I'm sure. I've seen a lot of these equity sessions as I'm walking in and out from my office, and they're down where used to be the lunchroom. That usually garners a good crowd. I know there's a lot of different educational sessions that go on there, but I've surely heard some of these. So appreciate that as well. Thank you, Chair.
Oh, thank you, Commissioner. Other commissioners? Yes, Vice Chair Farr.
Thanks, Chair Bernie. And I'm going to talk directly to Mo Young, who's with us today, right? And just, Mo, I just wanted to point out to you, and the reason I'm talking to you, Mo, is because I think of the very early days of beginning our equity work at Lane County. It's not where we started, but it's where we really began to formalize things. When you stood for days on end, it seemed, at a whiteboard, taking notes from a relatively small task force to identify how Lane County can begin to address equity and access, both internally and outward looking. And Mo, the work that you did back then really has laid the groundwork for the direction we're headed today. Your work resulted in the Equity and Access Committee Advisory Board, which meets on a monthly basis. And I know that Commissioner Krieger was on that board for a while. I attend many of the board meetings, and a great deal of ground has been covered in the last 7 years, but this symbolizes how much work we have to do. Chair Bernie, you have before you a letter at the end of this, at the end of today's presentation, the draft packet. I do support your signature on that letter.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any other commissioners? I knew Commissioner Trieger would want to weigh in. Yes, Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to thank the team as well for all the work, and particularly for how in the letter it talks about this being a sort of a daily practice, so that we're not just sort of waiting till work is done and then running it through a final filter to give it a go, no go kind of thing, but that we, this is really about a culture as an organization that we start thinking about, as I've said before, equity as both a container that holds all the work and also the through line for every decision and policy we make about how we're delivering services to community or how we're operating internally. So I just really, it's a subtle but important thing to have incorporated that into the letter, to talk about doing this, you know, on a daily basis, or I'm not looking at exactly what, but I appreciate the commitment of the group to making this part of how we operate and not sort of a program. I think a lot of people in the community hear Equity Lens and they've seen other entities take up Equity Lens work in a little bit more of a checkbox kind of way than we're doing. So I really appreciate the depth and the breadth that you're approaching the work, and also really enjoying how accessible it is to the public with the website, with the web page. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any other commissioner? No? Okay. Well, if so directed, I will not begrudgingly sign such a letter on behalf of the board. That meant I would be delighted to. I'm sorry. I want to say that Lane County is by far the whitest place I've ever lived. I think that's part of why there's some of the intentionality behind this, because in other places, you don't overlook it. You can't. As someone who has never engaged in an equity lens, but who has engaged in social justice and civil rights fights, mostly with people we've never heard of. But for those of you here on the call, if you don't know these names, I actually had the opportunity to know well Huey Newton, John Nisby, who I highly recommend you Google, who's a graduate of the University of Oregon, and broke the color barrier. I'm so sorry. Broke the color barrier for the Washington Redskins in the early 60s when Robert Kennedy was pressuring them to integrate Dolores Huerta. So I'm delighted this is moving forward. Honestly, from my experience, I've never done it institutionally softly like this, but I believe there's tremendous potential here, and I'm delighted with the intentionality of it all. I think there's so much for us to learn, and there are many thousands of shoulders that we stand upon. And I feel strongly to say, it's not as if this is happening for the first time, but this is a fundamentally different approach to institutional change. I believe that's what it is. And I commend you all for your investment in it. And I think you have the vast majority, if not full support of this board in moving forward. So thank you so much. I don't think you heard any questions, but I think you heard a strong voice of support. And before you leave us, is there anything else any of you individually would like to add, since we're on this particular topic, before we get head nods for signature of the letter? Okay. Mr. Rakoff, do we need to do head nods at this juncture? What's appropriate?
I think we're going to simply get it placed on your next consent calendar so that you'll be able to approve it at that time.
Thank you very much. And thank you all so much. It's good to see you again. Remotely. Bye-bye. We are now on item 12A, I believe, administration announcements, Mr. Mokraheisky. And forgive me for earlier, I didn't know about this discussion subsequent to agenda setting on that parks item.
Things move quickly, so how could you? Yeah, no worries, Chair and Commissioners. So what I wanted to spend my time here today was to report back to you. Last week you had some discussions about the Lane County employee vaccination requirement, the broader requirement. There are two currently that affect our employees. The first is the state Oregon Health Authority requirement, and then the second is the county requirement that affects the rest of our workforce, with the exception of law enforcement. So board had a few questions on that, and I want to report on three general areas just to talk about. First, the OHA mandate data and what we know to date relative to that group of employees that have been affected by that requirement. Second, the equity lens application. You just got a great update from our team on the application and use of our equity lens. So I'll update you on the work that we've done on that in the last few days. And then just want to make some general comments about how we our value and use of equity in the organization and how we go about doing that going forward. So first, I'll share with you the data for the OHA, the state vaccination requirement. There were 680 county employees that were impacted by that mandate. 674 of those employees complied. Of the 674, 646 chose to be vaccinated. 28 received exceptions. And as I mentioned this morning, 6, so I think I was wrong. I think I said 24 this morning. It's 28 exceptions, religious or medical exceptions. And then of the 6 people that received separations, 2 were full-time regular status employees and 4 were extra help. So that equates to those 6 separations are approximately 0.8% of the total number of people that were affected by this state requirement. Just in terms of the broad demographic breakdown of this group of 680 employees, approximately 73% of those 680 employees are white, and approximately the balance are employees of color. So approximately 22% of that group, or 150 people of color. Now, I want to be clear that we cannot provide the specific racial demographic information about those 6 separations. Important to note, because it's such a small number, small data sets are typically governed by standard statistical practice of not reporting fewer than a specific number, usually 10, as well as by state and federal rules. So for instance, the CDC has a committee that has provided guidance, both a federal, it's called the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology. And it is the standard practice in statistics to not report out data that's individually identifiable. So as an example, I think you saw on Mr. Adams, one of the slides he showed this morning is the county map, and it has the different shades of blue by zip code. And you'll notice in there, one of the things that we do is for any zip code that's under 10, we say 1 to 9. Right? We give a range because we want to make sure that we're not providing individually identifiable information in that. So given the fact that we had such a small number of people that were separated from service, we can't provide that specific information about those 6. So that's the information I have for you. What I can tell you about the balance of the organization, the demographic, at least the racial breakdown of the rest of the organization, excluding the sheriff's office and the OHA mandated employees, as of yesterday is approximately 82% white, and it looks like about 18% employees of color. So the demographics between the OHA mandated and the rest of the county are similar, but a larger percentage. There's a larger percentage of Hispanic employees in the OHA mandated group, larger percentage of white employees in the larger employee population, larger percentage of multi-ethnic in the larger employee population. So depending on how all of that shakes out, we can report back. We will report information that we can share with you about that. So that's that on the OHA piece. The board also asked, and we have applied the equity lens to this process. We've had a series of meetings. We had 3 members of the Equity Lens Committee work with 5 staff in leadership positions in 2 different meetings. And we went through, I think you heard from the group, so I'm not going to go through sort of the types of questions that we ask. I think it is important and really helpful for me as I continue to learn about our equity lens and how we apply our equity lens and what the purpose and how we're trying to do this is that we don't view the equity lens as a box to check or a right or a wrong on a policy decision or a pass or a fail. It's Mo Young said this to me yesterday. It was really helpful for my kind of context. Like this is about asking a series of questions to help sort of test us, to test assumptions, to make sure we're being thoughtful about people that are affected, people we haven't thought about, implications that may go beyond our common assumptions about a decision. That's what the tool is for, okay? So we need to be careful. When I say we, it's the collective we, and I might include myself in that too. Careful not to think, okay, we checked the box of the equity lens. We're good to go on. It's sort of a starting point to open conversations and test our assumptions. So when we use the equity tool to look at the county requirement, we found that many of the things that we did in that requirement would be the same. Only a couple, I should say, of steps that we would have done differently. I'll name a couple of those steps. One is we have a few employee resource groups that we've established through the pandemic, actually. And, you know, we looked in hindsight, we would have, and in the future, want to make sure we're engaging with those employee resource groups in decisions like this to get feedback, as well as our bargaining units. I had an opportunity yesterday to meet with one of our bargaining units, and in hindsight, that was, you know, if not for timing constraints and sort of the pressure that we felt under in making a decision around this issue, having the discussion specifically, providing the opportunity for representatives of the specific bargaining units and those employee resource groups were 2 areas that we would have, 2 additional discussions that we would have had. As I mentioned, the timing and urgency played into the decisions that were made. But the view of this team that did this review, these 8 individuals, is that the equity lens application would not have changed the ultimate decision. That the assumptions that we made in the creation of this policy were and are in the best interest of those affected. So it also important, I think, as you heard, the lens is still in a pilot phase and has not been officially rolled out yet. So it's part of the reason also that, you know, we're working through the right application and use here of that. And I think I really appreciate that the commissioners brought this to light and suggested that we use this because it further elevates the important use of this tool and of our equity value in the organization. Then finally, I just want to say broadly on the equity lens that the purpose of the equity lens is designed, as I sort of said, designed as a series of questions to challenge our assumptions, to consider who is not impacted by a decision, to examine barriers to participation for those that are impacted, to figure out what inclusive participation and communication looks like on a decision. So equity concerns should be considered in vaccination decisions, and really important that community members of color, community members whose communities have experienced medical neglect historically, abuse and mistreatment historically around these issues, that they should be engaged and consulted in policies such as that, engaged in ways that are meaningful. I want to say that we have really, you've heard equity updates from our COVID EOC team, from Dr. Warren, Dr. Ludke, Steve Adams. Recently, I believe in the last 2 weeks, you heard an update on that. A significant amount of intentional work has happened, early engagement of our equity coordinator and the equity team, hiring of an equity officer specific to the vaccination effort, the equity initiative that was reported last week to the board, our outreach and modeling of elders and leaders in communities of color. If you've seen the video series that we put out, having elders in communities of color sharing a message, as opposed to those of us that are in these established positions that maybe don't have the same trust in those communities as elders do. So we've had a very active vaccination campaign focused on access and tailoring messaging and partnership with communities of color. It's part of the reason why, because of that focus throughout the pandemic and the work that has been done, that I think we've had a higher degree of confidence in the inclusivity and the intent to eliminate disparities that have historically existed, particularly around vaccinations. Then I'll also say that county employees, this is an important distinction for us to consider in these kinds of things. County employees are offered robust benefits and wellness packages. So it's probably not, we need to be careful when we talk about communities of color, what opportunities are available for our employees versus individuals who are in our community, who are residents, and individuals of color within the community, but not employees. There's a difference in terms of access. So we want to be careful not to generically equate our employee population with the underserved and or misserved communities of color. And that, I think, highlights this broader point that what we're trying to do with our equity work in this equity lens is to be open to conversation, be open to challenging assumptions. I'm going to try to model some behavior. We encourage our employees to say this, right, in meetings. So I'll acknowledge the power dynamic that exists here. I work for the 5 of you, but I'm going to say some things here that are, I think and we say this to our employees too. When we have employees in our organization, we're talking about these issues, we encourage them to acknowledge the power dynamic when they're in a meeting with me, right? Because that's intimidating for folks to say things sometimes that are challenging. So I'm saying all of this with that understanding that there's likely intersection between these issues, but there should not be a blanket assumption that those populations, our employee population, is the same as the concerns and challenges that exist in the broader population. The other point, I think Mr. Adams has shared with the board in the past, I'm going to put this up, but I know you can't read it, but if you remember the kind of generally what that looks like, this is the, this is from the Kaiser Family Foundation, and it's national data around vaccine hesitancy and reporting on individuals that have received vaccine, that are absolutely opposed or unlikely, and those that are sort of open to that. So we also have this national data that indicates that, yes, there are communities of color that are historically and related to the COVID-19 vaccine have been vaccine hesitant, but there are also the groups that are mostly vaccine hesitant do not fall into those communities of color. So if you look at that national data, that's certainly the case. Okay, so I think that's everything. I know that's a lot that I threw at you. I'm happy to answer questions if I can. I want you to know that our team I'm reporting this stuff to you, but our team spent a lot of time working together in collaboration. I think it is really important that we all reflect on how we use equity and our equity lens and what our intent is in that, to make sure that we're applying it in a thoughtful and honest way to achieve eliminating historical disparities and making sure that everybody has the opportunity to participate in our services and in every opportunity that everyone else does. So I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Are there any questions for Mr. Mokrahajski? Yes, Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you. First, I just want to say I fully support the equity efforts we made in our vaccination clinics in trying to outreach to those communities that are tend to be vaccine hesitant or underserved. My criticism about the mandate has absolutely nothing to do with that. My very first question is, you noted we have 28 people applied for exceptions. Basically, the school districts are treating exceptions like refusal to get vaccinated, and they're placing their employees on unpaid leave with no possibility of coming back unless they get vaccinated. And they're basically denying almost all religious exemptions. What are we doing with our employees that applied for those 28 that applied for an exemption? Are they all being placed on unpaid leave?
Are the people on exceptions that have been approved being placed on unpaid leave? No. And I would say, you know, I guess I'm just taking on face value, Commissioner, what you said about the school districts. I don't know. So if that is the case, that is not the approach that we've taken related to exemptions here in Lane County.
Yeah, Springfield, Fern Ridge, and multiple others are placing their employees on unpaid leave. And you heard the letter that was read during public comment today. You know, the sincerity of religious, you know, strongly held religious beliefs is being questioned. And so we may only have 6 that were terminated, but if the 28 were placed on unpaid leave, I count them in with that 6. So that's where I was trying to find out where that lies. But can
I just offer one other, Commissioner, just a nuance to that I think is important. Is one of the things that we're in discussions on is testing is, you know, other requirements for those that receive exemptions or exceptions, right? So if you've been approved for I mean, I think you can see the numbers. You can see in I gave you the raw numbers, and you can see 6. I'll do it one more time. 680 people. Of those, 674 complied. 646 chose to be vaccinated. 28 received exceptions. 6 people did not. So it's pretty clear to see, you know, we did 28 approvals of exceptions. I don't know, but I will say, I think typically what we're seeing is the majority of those are within the religious exception. Very few people qualify for the medical exception for COVID. And then for those that are approved for the exceptions, you know, we're looking at different types of requirements related to specific masking and testing requirements on a regular basis.
I'm glad to hear people weren't placed on unpaid leave, because I believe that's not a reasonable accommodation of strongly held religious beliefs. I'm still a little disappointed because there was no answer to the question about whether we're having any disproportionate impact on people of color. And I know you can't give numbers or whatever, but even if there's we have 22% of those 680 were people of color, were more than 22% of the 6 and the 28 people of color, that would answer somewhat that question of whether we're having a disproportionate impact, based on the fact that there is this history and distrust of the medical profession from those people. And I will note that yes, there are groups that aren't people of color that have distrust. And I mentioned one last week, and I asked for data around this, and I haven't heard anything about it. But our veterans have a high mistrust and vaccine hesitancy. And it comes from their historic, abuse by the medical community, everything from Agent Orange to Gulf War syndrome over the years. And that's where we're seeing a high vaccine hesitancy. I have another lens that I use when I'm making decisions, and it comes from my basic libertarian philosophy of minimizing the use of force. And it's my use of force lens. And the first question I ask is it justified? Second question I ask is, will it be effective? And the third question I ask is, what are the unintended or negative consequences of using that force? And a vaccine mandate where people's jobs are being held over their heads is a use of force and coercion. So my question is it justified? with the downward trending cases we're seeing, even though we're still higher than the peak we had, we're on almost 8 weeks of downward trending. You know, will it be effective? And we've talked about, you know, how does this play to the general public? Does it make the rest of the general public more trusting or less trusting of vaccinations when we turn to coercion? And then finally, what are the unintended consequences? And my issues around disparate impact are one of those unintended consequences. So I would just, you know, just like an equity lens where they ask some of those very same questions. What are you trying to do? You know, is it justified? You know, is that outcome, you know, what are the negative impacts? All those questions are part of that equity lens. I think we failed to apply that up front. You know, and I think we need to seriously consider where we go from here. But you know, I get that I'm on a very small minority of this board on this issue, speaking of power dynamics, but I believe we are going to see additional costs in the coming year in the form of lawsuits, and it's not necessary. That's what really gets me. That first question: is it necessary?
Commissioner, I'm sorry. I don't want to interrupt, but
yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just a little bit upset because I don't feel like my questions got answered. I don't feel like we're being consistent. You know, I actually support the use of the equity lens. It's some great questions we should be asking about policy all the time. But I don't feel like it got used.
Mr. Mokrahysky, since this is your announcement time, did you want to respond at all? Or no?
No, I'm happy to. Thank you, Chair. I will say to Commissioner Bozovich's question about the equity lens, if I wasn't clear, that we applied the equity lens, we asked all of these questions, we did not identify, save the two areas that I mentioned of additional conversations we would have done different, we would have made sure we had in advance. It would not have changed the ultimate policy. So we asked all those questions, we did not identify, you know, and I appreciate that may not be the answer that's desired, but I think we also have to be, you know, we have to have integrity in this process, that we've set up the process, we empower people to ask these questions, to run these policies. Through that, we've done that, and we did not identify that the policy would result in additional disparities. I think it's also important to know, I don't have the data related to vets. We don't track that data. We don't track data. We do have a veterans preference in our recruitment process, but we don't track ongoing veteran data as a demographic. And of course, as important as veterans are, they're not a race. So related to racial disparities, it doesn't, you know, that wasn't part, at least, of our understanding of the concern that existed there. And then I will finally just say the number, I gave all the information to you that we can provide, right? The number that to give you specific racial demographic data about 6 individuals, at the best would be unethical. At the worst would be some potential violation of state or federal rule or law. And so it's really important just to know that it's a statistically insignificant as it relates to racial disparities, because the number is so small. So I guess that's all the information I can, and I appreciate that those answers don't satisfy everybody, but they are the facts.
I want to thank Commissioner Bozovich for asking the questions last week. I want to thank Mr. Mokrahysky for providing the data. I think those numbers are incredibly encouraging, by the way. And Mr. Rickoff, did you have your hand up or no?
Yes, sir, but the county administrator answered the question. We just don't have the data on veteran status. Okay. I do have one backseat, though, with the head nods when the time's right.
You have what? I'm sorry?
I have a backseat from the equity lens.
Backseat?
Backseat. I was informed by Diana Jones that it would be much easier to get head nods from the 5 of you on the equity lens letter now than for me to have to go and write a packet and for her to have the headache of tracking me down on that packet. So if there,
County Administrator, I would like you to notice that I asked the question about head nods and your COO told me no. And now your COO is saying, yes, we're going to do a backseat.
We're failing forward here.
we're failing forward. Thanks, boss.
On a public broadcast.
Are my grandsons in this meeting?
Vice Chair Farr, as Vice Chair, would you ask the question, the backseat question?
Chair Bernie, can we have head nods regarding acquiescence to your signing the letter that was provided to us in the draft package today?
Thanks, Vice Chair. I see enough. I don't see all, but I see unanimous head nods. Well, 4 head nods and 1 thumb. Thank you very much. You got now, Mr. Mokrahisi, are there any other announcements, or may we move on to Commissioner business?
Yeah, the last thing I said this, I think, but I just want to put be crystal clear about it. And I did receive verification that we have not denied any, that we have not placed, that no one has been placed on unpaid leave that has applied for an exception. And also that the process for those that have an approved exception is that they are required to wear a mask. There's a surgical or KN95 mask and receive weekly testing. So I just want to make sure that was clear.
Thank you. We're on item 13, Commissioner Business Announcements A. Are there any announcements? Oh, yes, Vice Chair Farr.
A very brief one, but is just kind of consistent with some of the discussion that we continue to have. Last Wednesday, I moderated the annual legislative breakfast for United Way, as I have each year for the last 8 years. And we had a number of senators and representatives there, as well as about 50 of our nonprofits were represented, or 50 members of the nonprofit community were there. A lot of different things were talked about, but the most significant thing that people had questions about is one that we hear about and continue to hear about more and more, and that is staffing, and both retention and recruiting and pay of staffing for our nonprofits. It's a critical issue that is getting even more critical all the time. I rarely attend a meeting that has anything to do with human services at all that does not become the main topic of discussion, as happened yesterday at the Human Services Commission meeting. Commissioner Trieger was at that meeting also, and she would acknowledge that we really had to cut the discussion off. The discussion would have gone on much longer than it did regarding exactly that, the recruiting, retention, and compensation for nonprofit staff.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any other Commissioner announcements? Excuse me. I would like to announce, kind of consistent with some of our earlier discussion this afternoon, that the young woman, Haley K. Scott, that I nominated as my appointment to the Climate Advisory Committee, and ended up chairing that, and actually Commissioner Bozovich's nomination vice chaired that committee. Haley is now with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. She was hired as a local climate justice organizer and is now one of its climate advisors. So I would simply like to provide kudos to this young woman who's just amazing. One of my greatest joys in life, in this position or not, is helping committed, passionate young people pursue their dreams and their careers. And it's been a real joy. I would also like to share that the Register Guard, once our hometown newspaper, that does not have the score of Ducks games the next day. The headline was Eugene Climate Justice Organizer hired as junior advisor to the White House. Had they said Lane County Climate Justice Organizer, that would have been great. In fact, she's a Springfield climate organizer. And so I want to call out that the headline is not quite right, and I hope someone from the Register Guard wants to call me on that. That's my announcement. Thank you very much for listening. I didn't see any other commissioner announcements. Are there future? Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Bozovich.
Somewhat tongue in cheek, but 1 month and 3 days after our announced policy, no other public agency has followed our mandate policy. We were supposed to be, quote, providing leadership.
Okay. Is that true? Okay, there's no comment. Okay. Review of assignments, Mr. Mokrahysky. Oh, excuse me. I know, yes, I saw it. I blew it. Future board assignment requests, Commissioner Buck, forgive me.
Thank you, Chair. And this is in reference to Representative Fahey's email to us a bit ago. And forgive me, but this is written down, so I'm going to be reading a little bit. But so Commissioners, I'd like to ask that we direct the administrator to return to us with a draft ordinance that extends the eviction moratorium established by Senate Bill 278 from 60 days to 90 days. Ideally, I'd like to see 120 days in the proposal. I want to be clear that this is only for the safe harbor portion of those individuals who can document that they've applied for rental assistance programs that we are already currently managing. These programs deliver money to landlords, and many applications have already been waiting 60 days for some relief. So the protection from eviction provided by 278 has already been exceeded through no fault of the renter. I'd ask that we consider this ordinance as the Board of Health so that we can ensure that every Lane County renter, not just those individuals from the unincorporated region, are included. I'm aware that there's an effort that to get the governor to call a special session in the legislature to address the issue, but that seems very unlikely. And a local ordinance is now necessary. But I think we need to get staff working on this issue in any event right away. Thank you.
So is this a request for head nods, Commissioner?
Yes.
Head nods? I'll go along with the head nod, but I would like to, yeah, please, Commissioner Bozovich.
I'll just say I'll support the idea if it's very narrowly tailored. I'll want to see how the ordinance is written, because we have never stepped into the realm of landlord-tenant regulation ever as a county.
So all of that makes sense. So this, Mr. Mokrahysky, you just let us know how long you'll need to develop something, or your staff, and bring that to the board. Thank you. Okay. Any other? Oh, Commissioner Trieger, forgive me.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure whether this needs to be an assignment or there's a request for agenda team, but maybe I'll phrase it as an assignment, and then County Administrator can redirect if there's a better process. I'm just thinking about our COVID updates. You know, of course, we were all feeling very hopeful for a time, and they had scaled back to, I think, just once a month. And then with the Delta variant surge and so on, we bumped the frequency of those back up. I'm committed to keeping our COVID updates a regular standing item. I'm committed to us hearing them as the Board of Health, but I'm wondering if we want to downgrade the frequency at this point, as there's not a whole lot of movement, and also knowing, of course, that public health staff can always, on a case-by-case, come back to us if something comes up in the interim between whatever that frequency might be, for instance, around youth vaccination or whatever it might be. So I'm just, and maybe the request is simply for County Administrator to confer with Mr. Adams and Dr. Warren about what's the right amount of time, but just looking at how packed our agendas have been and time management and how the information, there's just not really huge time sensitive movement in that, whether we want to just scale that back, that frequency back a little bit.
Mr. Mokrahysky?
I think that'd be like an agenda team request. We certainly, prior to the Delta variant, we were doing every other week. So if there's head nods and commissioners generally support that, we can just go to every other week or give discretion to the agenda team to schedule that as you'd wish.
Okay, I think acknowledged.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Are there any other commissioners? Because I'm 0 for 2 at recognizing hands thus far. Oh, by the way, just another, I should probably do this offline, but I had a call from the mayor of Springfield, Mr. Mokrahysky, and he and I thought it would be great if the managers of Springfield, Eugene, and the county could coordinate what the triggers are in terms of when we move to hopefully one day in-person meetings again. And we try to coordinate that together, especially since the county is providing the data that they're making their decisions on. So I just wanted to mention that to you. Okay, review of assignments.
Well, what I caught was 3 things: the head nods on the equity lens letter that I think we're going to have next week or soon on your consent calendar. The request from Commissioner Buck on the eviction moratorium extension, and then Commissioner Trieger's request regarding the frequency of COVID updates moving to once every other week or as the agenda team deems it necessary. Did I miss any?
Commissioners, not to my knowledge. It looks like you got it. Yeah. We're not done yet, are we? We have another executive session. So how much time would commissioners like for a bio break between being read into executive session and convening? Is 10 minutes enough? Would you prefer 15? 10 from Commissioner Trieger. That was either a 10 or a 20. I'm going to assume
it was a 5 or a 10 actually. I'm hoping to make it to an event up on campus later, and so but 5 minutes would do, but I won't argue with 10.
Okay, is 10 okay with everyone else?
10's good with me, Chair Bernie. I'll be going to audio only at 4:45.
Okay, well, Diana, if you would be good enough to read us into executive session, and then we will simply reconvene at 3:55.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. Just one quick update on the review of assignments. We did do a backseat and got head nods on that letter, so it will not be coming back on consent. It will just be signed now. And I like that word, backseat. With that, this is executive session for Tuesday, October 19th.
I apologize. It looks like Vice Chair Farr wants to get something in here.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. As I typically do when we're going to be discussing collective bargaining, declare a potential conflict of interest. My son is a member of ASME and a steward with that union. I have perceived no actual conflict of interest. I will participate in the discussion during the executive session.
Thank you, and forgive me, Ms. Jones. Please go ahead.
Okay. This is executive session for Tuesday, October 19th in the afternoon. The Board of County Commissioners will meet in executive session to conduct deliberations with persons designated by the governing body to carry on labor negotiations. This executive session is held pursuant to ORS 192.6602D, which allows the Board of Commissioners to meet in executive session for the purposes listed. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are asked to leave. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during the executive session, except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decision may be made in executive session. The Board of Commissioners reserves the right to come back out into public session should the need arise.
Thank you so much. See you at 3:55, 9 minutes.